What is the absolute worst thing that you can imagine happening to an aircraft? Fire? The engines or wings falling off, maybe? Well, if that sounds a little bit too unrealistic, then you definitely need to continue watching. Stay tuned. Back in the autumn of 1958, one of the greatest leaps in aviation history was taking place as the first passenger jets from Douglas Aircraft and Boeing entered service. The original Douglas DC-8 and the Boeing 707 were the first really successful jet airliners to enter production in the West, and while the ill-fated de Havilland Comet had already been around for a few years at that point, there was still a lot left to learn about the design and operation of these new, bigger and faster airplanes. Our story today starts 1 year after the introduction of these two aircraft back in the fall of 1959, when Boeing was working to certify one of their first updated 707 variants, the 707-220. This variant was made specifically to meet the requirements of the airline Braniff International Airways, who wanted more powerful engines for hot and high operations, among other things. The 707-220 therefore featured 4 Pratt & Whitney JT4 Alpha-3 turbojet engines, which each generated an additional 2,800 pounds of thrust over the JT3 Charlie-6 turbojets on the original 707 model. This variant would later be rendered obsolete by the development of turbofan engines, which are much more powerful and efficient than turbojets, so Boeing ultimately only built 5 220s, and they were all earmarked for Braniff. Now, to prepare for the arrival of the new aircraft, which would be Braniff's first ever jets by the way, the airline sent several of their pilots over to Seattle to receive comprehensive transition training from Boeing directly. The Braniff crews then first underwent about 160 hours of ground school, where they were introduced to principles of jet-powered flight, as well as more specific characteristics of the 707. And by October 1959, the pilots had completed their ground school and were able to proceed into flying the actual aircraft. At that time, the 707-220 had finished certification flight testing, but was still awaiting final FAA approval. But Boeing had received the go-ahead to conduct introductory training flights so that airlines could begin operations with the new aircraft as soon as it was finally approved. This meant that on the 19th of October 1959, 8 people arrived at Boeing Field in Seattle, Washington, in order to conduct their first training flights. And the group included 4 pilots from Braniff, 3 pilots from Boeing, plus 1 FAA inspector. In command of the mission was a 32-year-old Boeing test pilot and instructor who at the time had about 5,000 hours of total time, including 369 on the Boeing 707. Now, that was not a lot of experience for someone in this particular role, especially since the 707 had been in commercial service for a full year already, but he nevertheless had all of the required qualifications. The other Boeing personnel consisted of a second pilot and a flight engineer, and the Braniff crew included 2 captains, a flight engineer, as well as a technical instructor. But for the sake of this story, we will mainly take a closer look at the 2 captains. The first one was 49 years old with an astonishing 23,563 flying hours, which he had accrued over a career that stretched back to at least 1936. However, all of his previous experience had been on propeller aircraft, so this was going to be his first ever time flying a jet. The second captain was 43 years old with an equally impressive 20,450 flying hours, and like his colleague, this was going to be his first 707 experience. The 8th and final occupant was the FAA Air Carrier Operations Inspector, who was going to ride along as a passenger in order to observe the training process. Now, before the training day started, an instrument flight plan had been filed with its beginning and end at Boeing Field, with a training area defined north of Seattle and a planned fuel endurance of the aircraft of about 5 hours or so. But before we go any further here, I want to pause and address something that maybe some of you might be wondering about. Why were these pilots going straight from ground school and into the real aircraft at all? Well, that's because back in 1959, flight simulators were essentially not really a thing yet. Some very primitive simulators did exist, but they didn't bear much resemblance to the real aircraft at all, so they were mostly just used for learning where all of the switches and buttons were. And also, since the Boeing 707 was an essentially brand new aircraft, there certainly weren't any simulators available for it yet. This meant that at the time, there was really no substitute for gaining experience in a real-world setting. And if we look at the records, there were a lot more training accidents back then for this very reason. Anyway, one of the main objectives of these first training flights was to introduce the airline pilots to several flight dynamics that they wouldn't have encountered before, since they were quite unique to jet operations. These were aerodynamical peculiarities with special names like Mach tuck or Dutch roll, for example. And Dutch roll specifically is going to play a huge role in this story. So, what is it exactly? Well, let's have a look. An airplane in flight can rotate around any of three different axes. We have the pitch axis, which moves the nose up and down, and then we have the roll axis, which is where the wing goes up on one side and the other wing goes down. And on top of that, we have the yaw axis, where the nose moves left and right. Now for this explanation, let's focus on that yaw axis. When the aircraft, for example, yaws nose left, the right wing will move forward while the left wing will retreat backwards. And on a swept wing, like on the 707, this will cause the air to hit the advancing right wing at a more direct angle. And this, together with the fact that the right wing will also move a little bit faster than left, will basically increase lift on that side. So this extra lift then pushes the right wing up, meaning that a roll is also introduced as a secondary effect. So an initial yaw tends to also turn into a roll in the same direction. Makes sense, right? But as that yaw increases, the force from the oncoming airstream on the big flat surface of the vertical stabilizer also increases, eventually forcing the nose back the other way like a giant weathercock. And as the nose then swings back towards the right, inertia will keep it going all the way through the neutral position and into a slight right yaw, until the force on the stabilizer then reverses again and so on. Meanwhile, the rolling cycle follows the yawing cycle, only with a slight delay, and this repeating cycle of coupled yawing and rolling is what's known as a Dutch roll. This is actually a characteristic of any aircraft, but it's much more pronounced on aircraft with swept wings for the reason I explained before, where it could actually become quite dangerous. But before I get to why that was, another thing that can be quite dangerous nowadays are the various cyber threats that we constantly are surrounded by, which is one of the reasons I am so happy to have NordVPN as my sponsor. I use Nord for things like virtually changing my position to access all types of content I enjoy, including sporting events like my favorite hockey team playing or watching Formula 1. And as I am doing that, in the background, Nord is deploying several powerful cybersecurity tools that scans websites for malware, warn me about phishing attempts, and much, much more. And that just gives an added peace of mind, especially when I'm out traveling and using questionable public networks. I also use Nord to check for better prices on travel, hotels and rental cars, as they can vary depending on from where you are booking. Just make sure that you clear your cache between each time you try. Right now, I have an exclusive deal for just you. If you head over to nordvpn.com/pilot and select the 2-year plan, Nord will give you an extra 4 months of coverage just because you're coming from my channel. And if it then turns out that this is not for you, well, then that's not a problem, since Nord always provides a 30-day money-back guarantee, which means that you are not risking anything by trying. So head over to nordvpn.com/pilot or use this QR code to get the deal today. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the story. Now, swept wings are necessary in order to fly at higher speeds, close to the speed of sound, so they are normally only found on jet aircraft. And even though swept wings makes Dutch roll worse, it's important to understand that it normally isn't an inherently dangerous characteristic, just really annoying and uncomfortable for the passengers and crew. The way aircraft engineers are trying to design the aircraft is so that the Dutch roll characteristics are either stable or neutral. Stable Dutch roll means that the amplitude of each swing is smaller than the one before, eventually trending towards zero. And neutral Dutch roll means that each swing is the same size, so it will continue forever until something is done about it, but at least it won't get any worse. But what engineers definitely want to avoid is something known as unstable or divergent Dutch roll. This is then obviously where the amplitude of each swing grows larger and could therefore escalate until control is lost or the airframe tears apart by the involved dynamic forces. But what would actually start a Dutch roll then? Well, normally it occurs when something causes a sudden change in yaw, like a gust of wind for example, which can then start this repeating cycle. And that would mean that if an aircraft would have unstable Dutch roll tendencies, well then just a simple gust of wind could potentially turn into a real problem. For this reason, almost all passenger jets, whether unstable, stable or neutral, are equipped with something known as a yaw damper, which is a device that makes constant small rudder inputs in order to suppress or damp any uncommanded yawing movements. On the aircraft that I fly, the yaw damper is always on, making thousands of little inputs constantly over the course of a flight, and we pilots barely even have to think about it. Airline pilots today still learn about Dutch roll, obviously, when studying for their air transport pilot license, but we never really experience Dutch roll in the simulator, nor in the real aircraft, because it really only occurs in the event of a yaw damper malfunction, and even then the aircraft are mostly inherently stable right now. But the pilots in this story had Dutch roll training as a big part of their training syllabi, as early as in their first ever flight. So why was that then? Well, as it turns out, that's a really interesting question. Back in the 1950s, when the Boeing 707 was designed, everyone knew a lot less about these type of flight dynamics, and partly as a result of that, the original versions of the 707 actually did have a slightly divergent Dutch roll characteristic. This divergence wasn't extreme. Each swing was only very slightly larger than the one before it, so it would take quite a while before the cycle became actively dangerous. But it still wouldn't sort itself out without active pilot intervention. Now, the 707 did have a yaw damper to help with this, but in the earliest versions it was quite primitive and actually came with some of its own problems. You see, yaw dampers today are designed so that the pilots doesn't feel their inputs. They basically operate out of sight and out of mind. But on the first 707s, the yaw damper's rudder inputs were transmitted back through the control cables to the rudder pedals in the cockpit. Now, there are really only two times when the pilot needs to use rudder pedals on a large airliner in flight, and that's during a crosswind landing or takeoff, or during an engine failure, in order to cancel out the effects of asymmetric thrust. You see, when an engine failure happens, we will have to push rudder and yaw towards the live engine side in order to keep the flight path stable. But on these early 707s, the yaw damper would then try to resist that, forcing the pilots to have to apply excessive pressure on the pedals. And at lower airspeeds, control authority decreases, so pilots will have to push even more rudder in those scenarios to get the desired effect. And that obviously happens mostly during takeoff and landing. So in those scenarios, if the pilots also had to fight the yaw damper, well then the pilot force required to compensate for an engine failure could simply become too high, which would obviously be really bad close to the ground with little room for error. So for that reason, it was standard procedure on early 707s not only to disengage the yaw damper in the event of an engine failure, but to actually disengage the yaw damper preemptively during takeoff until the flaps were retracted and during the landing after full flaps had been selected. But remember, disengaging the yaw damper would expose the aircraft to the risk of unstable Dutch roll. And not only that, Dutch roll on all aircraft are also worse when the flaps are extended, which is precisely the configuration that the aircraft would be in where, in this case, the yaw damper was turned off. All of this meant that knowledge of Dutch roll characteristics, response and recovery were crucial for early 707 pilots. Now fortunately though, Dutch roll recovery isn't really that complicated. Basically, you only apply aileron opposite to the direction of the roll movement, so if you're rolling right, you make left roll inputs and the roll will then slowly finally stop. Now, with that, some yaw motion will then continue, which can be stopped using the rudder, but on the 707, just keeping the wings level was sufficient in most of the time. But there was a small psychological vulnerability in this procedure. You see, sometimes this recovery procedure would require the pilots to input ailerons towards an already quite low wing. Basically, if the left wing would be down, but the aircraft had already started rolling back towards the right, well then the pilot would actually have to apply left wing down aileron, while still in a left bank in order to stop the motion. And that would feel quite wrong and slightly counterintuitive, especially if the bank angle was very steep. Now, of course, if the pilot would apply right wing down aileron in that situation, he would be making the problem way worse by increasing the roll rate instead of cancelling it out. So basically, the pilots had to input aileron against the direction of the roll, not just towards wings level. And that is going to be super important to remember as we dive into the story about what happened on this particular flight. At time 13:30, the aircraft took off from Boeing Field and soon headed towards their practice area north of Seattle. And soon, all of the 8 occupants were also up in the cockpit together to observe the training. Sitting in the left seat, the Boeing instructor then walked the first Braniff captain through a series of pretty basic maneuvers, where he started by performing the maneuver himself and then helped the trainee to do the same thing correctly. Basically, this is something that we instructors refer to as patterning. The first few exercises were quite straightforward, but soon the maneuvers started to get a little bit more complex. The instructor now turned off the yaw damper and began to demonstrate Dutch roll in a clean configuration, meaning with the flaps and slats fully retracted. In a clean configuration at high speed, Dutch roll is quite mild, so the trainee captain was easily able to recover with the help of the instructor's coaching. But then it was time to demonstrate Dutch roll at low speed with the flaps extended to 40 degrees, which was the configuration where the 707 pilots were most likely to encounter it in real life. To do this, the instructor first slowed the aircraft back to 155 knots and then gradually selected the flaps down to 40. Now, the exact altitude that the aircraft was at this point isn't stated in the accident report, possibly because the flight data recorder wasn't hooked up yet. You see, at this time, federal regulations only required the flight recorder to be active when flying passengers, and there were sadly no cockpit voice recorders installed at all. But we can estimate that the aircraft was probably at a relatively low altitude, somewhere between 10,000 feet and above the overcast cloud base, which was situated at 4,000 feet. The reason we think that is because the instructor wanted to make sure that the aircraft handling wouldn't be too different from what it would be on final approach. And also because at much higher altitudes you can't really slow down enough to set the flaps to 40 anyway. So the Boeing instructor initiated the Dutch roll by using rudder and ailerons, and the plane therefore soon started swaying back and forth on a regular cycle. But the bank angles that he used to demonstrate this were quite excessive. Boeing's training manual specified that the desired maximum bank angle during a Dutch roll demonstration was 15 degrees, with an absolute maximum of 25 degrees. But the Boeing instructor inputs in this case far exceeded that. The Braniff technical instructor soon became concerned that the bank angles were above 25 degrees, and he then leaned over and reminded his colleague, the Boeing instructor, of these limits. The Boeing instructor replied that he was aware of this, but what he then proceeded to do demonstrated a deep-rooted disregard for the safety reasons behind these limits. You see, because the 707 was slightly unstable in Dutch roll, starting the sequence with a large bank angle could actually be quite dangerous, since it would take less time for the amplitude of the swaying to increase beyond the threshold for full loss of control. We also have to keep in mind here that these maneuvers were made for the purpose of training the Braniff captain who had never previously flown a jet aircraft. And now, within an hour from feeling the aircraft for the first time, he was being asked to recover the plane from the very edges of its controllable flight envelope. It is actually quite incredible to me as a modern pilot that Dutch roll recovery was even part of the training program on day one back then, and it's even harder for me to understand why the Boeing instructor would choose to intentionally exceed the bank angle limits with a brand new trainee next to him. In hindsight, there might have been some elements of macho here, a desire to show off his own skills in what was then the most technologically advanced transport aircraft in the skies, but of course, we can never really know what went on in his head here. What we do know though, is that he now suggested that he should switch seats with the trainee so that the Braniff pilot could experience this Dutch roll recovery from the left seat as well. The Braniff captain consented to this and the pair then swapped their positions. After that, the Boeing instructor again initiated the Dutch roll sequence, and despite being reminded of the bank angle limits, he didn't tone down his input this time either. In fact, he did the exact opposite. Using the controls to their fullest extent, he now sent the plane into a roller coaster ride with bank angles varying between 40 and 60 degrees in both directions. The poor Braniff captain allowed several oscillations to occur before steeling himself for the recovery, and then he grabbed onto the yoke and turned it in completely the wrong direction. Now remember what I said about how you have to turn against the direction of motion independent of which wing is down? So that's right, with the left wing still down, but rising in this case, he now applied right aileron, causing the roll rate to increase rapidly and the subsequent right bank angle to move beyond 90 degrees in just a few seconds. This obviously then triggered the instructor to intervene and try to recover from this. Now, early 707 pilots were trained to recover from Dutch roll with rather sharp aileron inputs, so the instructor responded rapidly and forcefully, and as it turned out, quite a bit too forcefully. His inputs were so large that instead of cancelling out the momentum of the roll, he completely reversed its direction, and within a short time, the plane was now rolling even faster to the left than it had done to the right. This was then followed by a series of oscillating snap rolls right and left with corresponding rapid changes in direction. Within the space of just a few seconds, the instructor had gotten himself into something that we'd refer to today as severe pilot-induced oscillations. You see, since our brains move faster than the airplane responds to our control inputs, it's easy to over-control when trying to recover from an unwanted maneuver like this. And that's because if we don't immediately see the response that we want, we tend to unconsciously add more control force, which just then adds to the oscillation. In some cases, these oscillations can therefore also become divergent, meaning that each one becomes bigger than the last until the airplane is literally torn apart. That's, by the way, also what happened to American Airlines Flight 587 back in 2001, which I haven't yet covered on this channel, but I will. In that case, the pilot made larger and larger opposite rudder inputs until the sideways load on the vertical stabilizer exceeded its ultimate strength, leading to a structural failure. In this case though, with the pilot making larger and larger opposite roll inputs, the biggest stress was not on the tail, but instead on the wings, as they rapidly reversed direction over and over again. These reversals were especially hard on the engines and their mounts, since they are the densest and heaviest components of the aircraft, meaning that they hold a lot of momentum and inertia. At a certain point, the amount of force required to cause a rapidly moving engine to reverse direction becomes so great that it will just rip the wing apart. And for this reason, the 707's engines, and actually all underwing turbine engines, were designed so that the fittings attaching the engine to the pylon structure would fail before the wing did. And that's exactly what now happened. After several extreme oscillations, the pylon fittings for engines 1, 2 and 4 suddenly failed due to the extreme overload that they were being subjected to. In the cockpit, 3 loud bangs were heard, and all 3 of the affected thrust levers snapped back to idle and then went completely slack, since the control cables connecting them to the engines had been severed. But that would be a later problem for the pilots. First, the aircraft needed to be put back under control. The instructor finally managed to stabilize the oscillations, but when the airplane stopped rolling, it was still in an inverted position with its nose pointing down towards the ground. So in order to recover, the instructor continued rolling left completely into a full barrel roll before finally returning to wings level in a medium dive with the airspeed rapidly increasing. Fortunately, he was then able to stop that dive without overloading the aircraft any further, but it was at that point immediately clear that they had now lost thrust on 3 out of their 4 engines. The FAA inspector volunteered to go back and look out the cabin windows to assess the damage, and when he did, he quickly observed that engines 1 and 4 had completely departed the aircraft, and that the number 2 had partially separated and was now tilting backwards with its exhaust area impending upward into the fully extended trailing edge flaps. On top of that, fires were now burning in all of the holes where the engines should have been, likely due to the fuel from the tanks igniting as the engines fell off. When the inspector returned to the cockpit to report this, the Braniff technical instructor looked back at the left wing and he saw that the number 2 engine had now also fallen off and had been replaced by a massive fire fed by the broken fuel feed lines. Meanwhile, down on the ground, witnesses in the area of Lake Kavanaugh near the town of Arlington, north of Seattle, had heard the plane overhead but hadn't been able to see it due to the overcast cloud layer. They had then heard some type of large, loud noise, followed by the disturbing sight of 3 Pratt & Whitney JT4 Alpha engines just falling out of the clouds, with no sign of the aircraft that they had once been attached to. Can you imagine that? Anyway, these witnesses could only guess at the magnitude of the emergency that the crew was now facing on board the crippled aircraft. Although the Boeing 707 wasn't designed to be able to maintain altitude on only 1 engine, this aircraft was completely empty and was also missing the weight of 3 out of its 4 engines, so it might have been able to possibly limp back towards an airport if it hadn't been for the raging fire that was now rapidly consuming their left wing. The loss of 3 generators had also left the aircraft with basically no primary electrical source, so a number of other systems were inoperative as well. As the Boeing instructor put the plane into a shallow descent, the Braniff captain remained in the left seat, while the Braniff flight engineer handed over his station to his Boeing counterpart. Meanwhile, as the plane now descended through the cloud base at 4,000 feet, the Braniff technical instructor caught sight of the Lake Kavanaugh in front of them and suggested that maybe they should try and ditch in the lake. But the Boeing instructor thought that he could find a better place to put the aircraft down, so he turned past the lake and down a tributary creek towards the nearby valley of the Stilanguamish River. Outside, the witnesses now saw the plane emerge from the clouds, with 3 engines missing and a huge plume of fire pouring from its left wing and then streaking past its tail. On board, the Braniff flight engineer, the Braniff technical instructor, the second Boeing pilot and the FAA inspector concluded that a crash landing was imminent, so they left the cockpit to sit down in the tail section, whilst the second Braniff captain stayed in the cockpit and strapped himself into the remaining jump seats. And these split-second decisions about where to sit would soon end up having enormous consequences for the 8 people on board this crippled 707. The 4 who chose to sit in the back soon found themselves with a direct view of the escalating fire, which had now grown so large that it was starting to crack the windows and bubble the paint on the vertical stabilizer. From the cabin, they could also see that the fire had burned a hole clear through the wing, making the internal wing structure of spars, cords and stringers fully visible. On top of that, the fire had also burned a hole through the flaps and completely destroyed the left inboard aileron. Now, the 707 had both inboard and outboard ailerons, but they weren't independent. The outboard ailerons were driven mechanically by the inboard ones whenever the flaps were extended to provide more roll control. And with the flaps retracted, the outboard ailerons weren't used at all, just the inboard ones together with the spoilers. So this meant that due to the loss of the left inboard aileron, the left outboard aileron now also was lost. And the final report indicated that the right outboard aileron for some reason also didn't work, but it didn't really explain why that was. The best my team and I was able to come up with was that this had to do with some kind of issue related to the flaps, but we aren't really sure, so if you think that you know the answer to this, let me know in the comments here below, and don't forget to subscribe when you're down there. Anyway, according to the final report, by this point only the right inboard aileron and the right outboard spoilers were working, which together made up only about 3/8 of the 707's normal roll control. The rudder could also be used to indirectly induce roll using yaw, but that option was compromised because the hydraulic pumps that helped the pilots move the rudder had stopped working when the electrical power was lost. Now, it was still possible to move the rudder manually through the control cables, so that would have taken a lot of muscle force to do. All of this was a huge problem, because the still functional number 3 engine on the right wing was providing asymmetric thrust, and on top of that there was excess drag on the left wing, where the raging fire had now also burned a 35 square foot hole in the upper wing surface. This meant that the aircraft now wanted to yaw towards the left and also drop the left wing, since it was producing way less lift than it should due to the hole and to the damage of the flap. The pilots tried retracting the flaps from 40 degrees back to 28, which improved roll control a little bit, but there was still barely enough to counteract the asymmetric thrust and drag that they were now facing. Approaching the river valley, the pilots now desperately searched for a landing site, and they finally found an open field that might just be long enough. But their aircraft was now on the verge of falling apart, and it was soon also rocked by an explosion as more fuel vapors ignited. Melted pieces of the left wing was now running backwards across the fuselage and also falling down in a trail behind them. As the pilots tried to finally slow down for landing, their control authority decreased even further due to the slower airflow over the control surfaces. And this meant that if they didn't reduce the asymmetry somehow, or increase their speed, they would quickly lose lateral control and possibly go into a spin. But increasing speed wasn't an option. If they increased power on the engine 3, they would just make the asymmetry even worse. And if they gained speed by descending, well, then they would crash before they reached their landing site. So instead, the Boeing instructor now made the only move that was available to him. He shut down their only working engine in order to reduce the asymmetry. But unfortunately, shutting it down also now caused their descent rate to increase, and in the last few seconds it became clear that they weren't going to make the field that they were aiming for. So as they descended into the dense temperate forest below them, the aircraft clipped the tops of several trees at a height of 33 meters, crossed another 120 meters of open land, and then plowed into several more trees. A tree trunk finally severed the outermost 5 meters of the badly damaged left wing, which finally caused the plane to roll rapidly over to the left as it emerged from the forest and shot out over across the shallow waters of the Stilanguamish River. At this point, the left bank was over 45 degrees, and the plane finally slammed into the opposite riverbank, where a huge fireball then consumed the tumbling wreckage. The forward part of the fuselage was completely destroyed by the impact, but the tail section continued forward across the bank and then back into the river, where it finally came to rest in the gravelly shallows. To their amazement, the 4 personnel seated in the rear of the cabin found that they had all survived the crash, and only one of them was seriously injured. Unfortunately though, those in the cockpit had not been so lucky. All of them had been instantly killed when the aircraft broke apart after the first impact. The Civil Aeronautics Board, which is the predecessor to the National Transportation Safety Board, found that the probable cause of this accident was the structural overload of the engine pylons due to excessive control inputs by the Boeing instructor pilot. However, Boeing and FAA engineering experts also recognized that design improvements of the aircraft could have mitigated not only the consequences of the botched training demonstration, but also some of the need for that demonstration in the first place. In addition to re-emphasizing the 25-degree bank angle limit for Dutch roll training, Boeing, after this accident, also added an independent backup hydraulic system for the rudder that would work even without main electrical power. And even more importantly, Boeing also increased the size of the 707's vertical stabilizer and added a ventral fin in order to improve its directional stability. During a Dutch roll, the yawing motion reverses direction when the aerodynamic side load on the stabilizer exceeds a certain threshold, so increasing the stabilizer area would cause that point to be reached at a lower side slip angle, which significantly improved the 707's stability during Dutch roll. Later versions of the 707 were then also equipped with a more modern yaw damper that worked without moving the rudder pedals and could be kept engaged throughout the entire flight. Now, a crash like this wouldn't happen today for a million different reasons, not least because we now train in incredible full flight simulators, so a training flight like this would have never taken place. But I still think that it is useful to be reminded that on non-fly-by-wire aircraft, it is and has always been possible to overstress the airframe by making too large repeated inputs. Pilot-induced oscillations like this are an issue that still comes up from time to time, and it is super important to avoid rapidly moving the controls back and forth, since the resulting structural loads can build up incredibly quickly. So if you're a pilot out there watching this, that's what I want you to take with you. Now, can you imagine being on a flight where the pilots are effectively playing around in the front? I'm guessing you would likely skip that if you could, but as my next video will show, this does happen, sometimes with some quite interesting consequences. And if you want to see that video right now, then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. My patrons are now previewing this video, and I would love to hear what you think about it as well. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt, and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.